Welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires, the show where we talk about finding strength when life falls apart. I'm your host, Melie, and around here, resilience isn't perfection. It's falling flat, getting back up, and maybe laughing about it later. From breakups to breakthroughs, we mix faith, neuroscience, and a little sass to help you rebuild a life that actually feels like yours. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. My guest today is Dr. Sharon Spano, who has spent her career helping high-impact leaders uncover the hidden barriers between achievement and true fulfillment. She's an executive coach with a PhD in human and organizational systems, and she's a master at blending science, leadership, and personal transformation. Through her coaching, her podcast, The Other Side of Potential, and her book, The Pursuit of Time and Money, Sharon helps CEOs, consultants, and entrepreneurs move beyond the grind into growth that actually feels meaningful. Today, we are going to dive into a conversation on the emptiness of success, why it shows up even when everything looks perfect on paper, how to find peace and purpose on the other side of all that striving, and what to do if you find yourself in the middle of that emptiness. So, Dr. Sharon, thank you so much for being here today. I'm excited to dive into our conversation.
Thank you so much, Melie. I'm delighted to be here today.
Yeah, so I know for many of my listeners, they are looking to, build emotional resilience, climb that ladder of potential. But there tends to come a time when they are achieving their goals, but it doesn't quite feel the way we think it should. And I know for a lot of those folks, they ask, is that normal? So let's start with that. Is that a normal feeling to have when you are achieving the goals you've set for yourself?
It's not so much normal when they're going through the achieving process, I guess I want to say, because typically, we start our careers and we have goals in mind and we're moving through all those opportunities and we're so in it. And often, people are raising families, getting married, whatever the case might be, that they're not really noticing that emptiness of success that usually comes later when they have achieved the accolades, built the business, whatever it is. Now I have the money, the house, the cars, all the toys, and then it's not perhaps what I thought it was going to be. And a lot of times what I see when clients come my way is they feel disconnected, maybe from their children, their significant other, maybe they've been through a divorce, whatever situations have hit them, they start to realize that, what I thought life was going to be if I had all of these things, these toys, these bows, these whistles, the money is not what I anticipated. And I think that's when the emptiness of success starts to, and they won't call it the emptiness of success, but they will say to me, something is missing. I feel empty. And that's why I coined the phrase emptiness of success, because I was seeing it so consistently.
Interesting. And is this different from burnout or being tired, or are those related?
I think they can be related, but often when I see it, they're not necessarily burned out. And so this would probably be a good opportunity for me to explain a little bit about the 12 stages of human development, because my work is grounded in human development and trauma informed. And the 12 stages of human development, based on over 70 plus years of research, that's kind of where we know to this point in time that there are 12 stages. Most people are familiar with the earlier stages, because that's, birth to adolescence kind of thing. In fact, it's so interesting to me, Melie, because years ago, we didn't realize that people developed beyond adolescence, because we thought, well, you're an adult now, or you're moving into adulthood. And we kind of based that notion on the idea that the frontal cortex of the brain is pretty much developed. I think for women, it's around 21, maybe men 22. But if you think about it, that's sort of an absurd theory, because we continue to have life experiences, many of them in our adult years. That's kind of when the trauma or those world-changing events can hit us. And so we make meaning from those moments, and we either develop into the later stages or we kind of stay stuck. The average American in the workforce, I think we now say about 68%, is at stage 5 or 6. So there's a great room. You can see if there's 12, there's an opportunity to grow and expand your consciousness, as we say, into the later stages. So what I see and what is so exciting for me in my work, Melie, is that when people hit that wall, that emptiness of success, they're often just leaning into another stage of development and they don't know it. So it may include burnout. Often it doesn't because they still have the drive, but they're starting to question, is this all there is in life? I'm looking for something more. I was just on a call with a client yesterday who went on a very, as he called it, life-changing excursion into, some jungle somewhere where he did all this hiking and whatnot. And he said it changed everything for me, Sharon. And what changed for him, he had what we would call a developmental shift because he's worked so hard all his life. He's never taken time to get out and push himself in nature and really connect to the deepest part of self, which is often what happens when we're in these remote places and having these kinds of experiences. And he was just so bowled over. And I said to him in the moment as he was describing it, I said, what you're describing is joy. And that's what we've been talking about, is how to create more joy in your life. But when we're in that achiever mode, go, 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 it might feel like joy, but it's not the truest sense of joy where we expand, as I said, our consciousness in a way that is truly life-changing and transformational.
Interesting. And you mentioned most workers, you said 68% are in stages 5 or 6. Does that mean that most people don't necessarily hit all 12 stages, or do those just come later?
No, because it's not necessarily equated to age. Most people don't get there at all. So when you get into like stage 12, we only know of maybe 1% of the population that is there. And it's not that one stage is better than the other, but I liken it to kind of the analogy of a mountaintop. If you're living on Main Street and you're in your crib, right? All you know is your hand and mom's face coming over the side of that crib. You don't have much perspective beyond that, as a baby. And then as we mature and start to go into school and we meet new friends and, now we can see beyond Main Street because we know the town, right? But it's not necessarily a linear experience in the way that I'm describing it. But if you can imagine yourself at the top of the mountain, you have a broader perspective. I live in the mountains of North Carolina in the summer, and, there's Mount Mitchell there. When I go visit Mount Mitchell, I can see across 4 states. So it's not the best analogy, but to give you a sense of when we expand consciousness, it affects everything within us because we now have broader perspectives, more empathy, more compassion, more understanding. Most of us in the earlier stages, we live in what we call a first person perspective. And so that's where we are as a child, as an adolescent. It's all about me, 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 me. As we mature into adults, it becomes more about survival and creating the results I need to feed my family, build my business, whatever it is. And then as we get into the later stages, we're more connected to humanity, the universe. We literally start to think more about the planet and world consciousness. It's not just about my small little world. So it can feel very scary when someone is leaning into what I call another stage because I haven't been there. And suddenly the things that I thought I knew or I believed in or that mattered to me are starting to fall away because I'm actually stepping into the potential for a new identity. And unless you understand that, and that's really where my passion lies in the work that I do, is helping people understand that no matter where you are in this spectrum of, called life, the harder it gets. And to your point, when you're in that dumpster or, in those fires, there's an opportunity for growth.
Absolutely. Now, for somebody who is going through this, does this show up differently for men versus women, or is this a pretty universal experience?
Well, it's a universal experience, but we're different as men and women. So I can share a personal example of that. I am later stages now because it's the field I'm in and I've done the work. You have to do the work in some form or another. And years ago in 2008, my husband and I lost our son, Michael, who was born with a developmental disability. He had a metabolic disorder. And Michael was supposed to live to the age of 2. He wound up living with great due diligence on our part and the grace of God. He lived to 27. But when we were in the grieving cycle, my husband, who is earlier stage and very successful, but just in a different place, he was more concrete in his actions. People in the earlier stages are more concrete. And what that meant for him was going to the cemetery 3 times a week and making sure that our son's gravesite was perfectly manicured and kept up. And that was not a need of mine. I am at a later stage, as I said, although I wasn't as late as I am now. My grieving process took me to another place, but even back then, I was still later stage than my husband. So my tendency for the grieving process was not so much about concrete as it was abstract actions. So it was prayer, it was meditation, it was journaling, it was time in scripture because I am a woman of faith, it was writing letters to my son, and it was just different. And I think that's an important thing to understand, that different people at different stages will have different actions, particularly in the grieving process. But at one point, my husband said to me, "Why are you doing better than I am?" And I said, "I'm not doing better than you are. I'm just doing it differently." And so, again, to stress that we never want people to think that one stage is better than the other, but the object is to live the most robust life at whatever stage you're at. And it's complicated. Each stage has, that's why I wrote the book on time and money, because one of the things that I learned in working with clients was they had different experiences of time and money. And I was curious as to how that would look from a developmental lens. And so we did the work around that, to find some of those nuanced distinctions to help people better understand, because as you well know, certainly money and time, they're the two most important resources that we often make multiple decisions on throughout our day. Do I have enough time? Do I have enough money? They're also very contentious in marriages and partnerships and all kinds of things. I found it helpful to have that information to share with people so they could understand, if I'm with someone in business or life who has a different perspective or a different way of being in relation to time and money, often it's a developmental distinction, and that can help us move to a better place in working with one another and living with one another.
Now, you mentioned that you are a woman of faith, and I'm really curious from a faith perspective. How does this story of achievement and success get distorted for faith based folks?
That's a very interesting question. I think because scripture gets misinterpreted,
Yeah.
the rest of it gets misinterpreted. And so, I know I grew up with the scarcity mentality because we were poor, and we were taught that rich people were bad people. They were, quote, like the Pharisees, who, by the way, killed Jesus, and you don't want to be like them. And so I did not grow up into a natural environment of abundance. It's taken me many years to realize that God wants the best for us, and there's nothing wrong. Scripture says, it's not money that is the root of all evil. It's the love of money. Meaning, if we put that before family, before God, before everything else, that's when we get into trouble. But we often lose sight of that. And so I think in the church in general, the institutional church, we do a lot of conversation. There's a lot of conversation around being servants and humble and giving. And it's a beautiful thing, because without that, I don't know where our society would be without the things that the church and the people in the church are able to provide and offer our society. But I think, I know at least, I've grown up in the church all my life, and there's a lot of women who believe that means self-sacrifice to the point of where they don't take care of themselves, or maybe they're serving in the church so much they neglect their own families, their own husbands. I've seen a lot of that in the institutional church. And I've seen it with the men, who are pastors and in leadership roles, where they're so devoted to their church environment, and it's almost to the point of being egocentric, that they're not being who they need to be in their own families. So I think there's levels and levels of misinterpretation within the church body that need to be re-examined. And we can always do well to remember that our God is an abundant God who wants the best for all of us and who wants the best for the world. And then how we play that part, I think, is to, kind of, to use the old euphemism, put the oxygen mask on ourselves first
Mhm.
and live in abundance, live in wealth, live in health, so that we are equipped to give the highest version of ourselves to the world.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a cool way to think about it because a lot of times, I've heard within the church, like, oh, you don't want to focus too much on, trying to be successful. That's not what God would want. Focus on God. And yet, when we are successful in life, that's when we are in a position to be the most help to others around us.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, that to me, it's taken me practically a whole life to realize that we need wealth in the world. And yes, are there greedy, wealthy people in the world? Well, of course, we know that there are, but there are as many wealthy people in the world who do tremendous good, and they do it behind the scenes, and people don't even know about it. And so, not that wealth should be the goal, but we certainly don't need to run and hide from it.
Right. Yeah, I love that new perspective. You often talk about how high impact leaders need tools that give x-ray vision into their hearts, minds, and systems. Can you talk a little bit about what kinds of systems you're pointing to and how they contribute to that emptiness of success?
Well, I think most leaders, high achievers, are really good. Obviously, they wouldn't be successful at generating and creating the what I call concrete systems around them, marketing systems, financial systems, operating systems, all those things they need to run their work environments, their businesses. But very few of us are aware of the human dynamics of human systems. Everything in the universe is a system. It all begins with energy down to the smallest particle. And so I have spent my career and been just so delighted to find out the power of understanding those dynamics in those systems and the energy in those systems and the patterns in those systems. And it's really what I teach my clients to do, is to self-witness what is going on in the systems that you're in, because we're in multiple systems all of the time. Some of us are in blended family systems, which gets very complicated. You're in multiple work environments, multiple systems there. And so what are the patterns and how are you showing up in the context of those multiple systems? And when we learn to look at the world we live in and work in from a systemic point of view, it takes out a lot of the angst and the us versus them conversations, because the system has a life of its own and it never lies. If we pay attention to what it's telling us, as weird as that might sound, we have then an informed way to make more important or meaningful decisions and choices. The patterns will tell us what is actually going on there. And it also takes out that egocentric kind of perception that, again, it's them causing the issues here. When the system is out of balance, what you'll see is increased tension, even chaos, like we're seeing in the United States right now, pretty much
Hmm.
just chaotic situations everywhere you look. And eventually, I mean, on a larger scale, war. And so every system is trying to reach some level of equilibrium. Unfortunately, our human nature is to disrupt that potential. And so I just love teaching people about those dynamics, because again, they realize that the system is in many ways bigger than they are. And when they understand that, again, they can make more informed decisions and choices.
Interesting. And so for those systems, does that depend on, as you talked about before, the stages, like what stage somebody is in?
Well, the systems are unique in and of themselves, but we interpret them differently based on the stage. So an example that I can give you is when someone in the early stage, let's just look at time, for instance, in my Time Money book. In the early stages, you think of a teenager, they literally cannot see beyond the moment. So when your teenager, is given the car and told to be home by 10 o'clock and he shows up at 1 in the morning, somewhere in the back of his mind is your voice saying be home by 10 o'clock, but he's caught up with his friends and his own, first person agenda of, I don't care. I'll pay the price later. I'm hanging out with my friends till 1 in the morning. And our prisons, to give another example, are full of individuals who cannot see the consequences of an action over time. So as you move through the stages, you live in the moment, then you might be able to project a year or two out. When you get into the later stages, you have the potential to see the rippling effect over generations. You can literally see time forward. And so that's one example of how our perception of time systems, money within those systems, it's affected or impacted, I should say, influenced by whatever stage you are currently at.
Okay, interesting. And so I am sure listeners right now are wondering, How do I know what stage I'm at? And so this would probably be a great time to let them know there will be a resource available for all of you at sharonspano.com/dumpster fires. And I will have that link also available in the show notes. So don't worry if you're not in a place where you can write it down right now. It will be linked in the show notes below. Can you speak a little bit to that resource?
Yes, well, how we know what stage somebody is, let me back up just a minute. And there's only maybe five major theorists across the world that have done this level of research, is by language. Unfortunately, the assessments to determine that are very costly for a variety of reasons. So, what I have done, because my dissertation is in the stages, I developed a quiz, if you will, that focuses on the six major stages of human development that we see in the workforce. Obviously, you don't need to be tested on the 0 to adolescent because most of us are past that. And we don't need to be tested necessarily on the later stages because most of us are never going to get there. I mean, it would be like, Gandhi, Jesus, I don't know who would be in the very last stage, but it wouldn't be most of us that are still working. So I've named this the leader's edge because it gives you that edge of information, and you can go in there and it's a free assessment, take the assessment, and then it'll tell you where you land, what we call the center of gravity, because we're never one thing all of the time, as I'm sure you know, Melie. So you'll be primarily in one stage, but probably under stress, you'll regress to an earlier stage. And then sometimes when you're feeling very enlightened, you might, move forward a little bit. And it'll give you that information with some action steps and some things to think about in terms of your own future development.
Interesting. And can you give, I know obviously it depends on the stage that somebody finds themselves in, but what are some examples of maybe action steps that might be given to somebody?
Well, for instance, at what we call the expert stage of human development, and again, these are not related necessarily to age or disciplines, but I do see, I work a lot with engineers and I've worked with financial advisors and people that are more concrete and technical in their training. So they are often at what we call the expert stage of human development. And so their focus is often on details, crossing every T, dotting every I, and they may be extremely efficient, but not always effective, meaning they can take too long on projects. They can, procrastinate. There's a variety of things that they do. So if I'm working with someone who's at the expert stage of development, the first thing we look at is, what are you challenged by? What's causing you issues? So an example might be one of my engineers who has trouble with his billing. He wants to focus on the plans and the work at hand. He doesn't want to focus so much on doing his time log, which upsets everybody in accounting, finance, billing, all those things. So we might say, okay, we're going to do some work around helping you think about time a little bit differently. How are you managing your time? How are you allotting time for this most important element of your business that you're neglecting? On the other side, our achievers, which is the next stage, are often where we see entrepreneurs, people who are more driven by goals and time and money. And they may take on too many projects. It's unique to every individual. They may be, the entrepreneur that, starts up too many businesses and then he's spread too thin. So in that case, I might have to pull him back a little bit and say, let's look at how you're goal setting. Let's look at how you're thinking about time and money. So again, it depends on the individual, but basically, I think if people could understand that when I am struggling with something in my life, in whatever form, it is again an opportunity for what we call in my field developmental shifts. Often it's about communication. I'm working with a man right now who's wonderful and he's quite brilliant, but he has in his mind a tendency to think the way to deal with his colleagues is to just get in their face and tell them off. And, he's kind of that rough around the edges kind of guy. And he literally just did not know that there was another way to communicate. So now we're working with, how can you be a more effective communicator, based on who you are and the stage that you're at. So I don't know that I'm giving you enough concrete action steps because it varies depending on the individual and what's going on with them.
That makes perfect sense. Now, are there any daily or weekly practices that you recommend to anybody, no matter what stage they're in, so they don't necessarily reach a full level of emptiness when they hit success?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, we always start with knowing and understanding that it's very important to have a high level of self awareness. We hear so much about that in today's market, but what does it really mean? Again, our natural instinct is to come from a first person perspective. We're egocentric beings. And so I want people to understand how to witness themselves in the moment, and that takes practice. So what we do is we learn, and when you talk about daily, I create customized practices for my people, and I have them journal every single day. And for someone out there who doesn't have a coach, to help them, determine what that might look like, literally just noticing, at the end of the day, just reflecting, even if you hate journaling, just in your own mind, like what worked well today, where did I show up at my highest level, where did I struggle? Eventually you start to notice yourself in the moment. And I always liken it to, being the director of your own movie, imagining that you're watching yourself through a camera, and at the same time you're directing your own actions as the actor. Because most of us go through the day and we're kind of reactive in some ways, in many instances. And then at the end of the day, we regret or have guilt or shame over the way I behaved in a meeting, or I didn't achieve this goal, or, whatever the scenario might be. When we learn to self witness, we are able initially to make changes in the moment. And eventually we have such a high awareness of our own way of being in the world that we stop doing many of the things that no longer serve us or the people around us. So it's really about paying attention to how I'm showing up on a moment to moment basis. And I say start with something small, whatever it might be. How am I communicating with my colleagues today? I have a client right now that has trust issues at work. And I talk about trust as having two main elements, competency and benevolence. So he, for instance, is watching himself in his interactions to see how competent am I showing up today? How benevolent am I showing up today? And what can I do to be better in those two areas such that I initiate higher levels of trust with my colleagues?
Interesting. Okay. And a lot of that can come, like you said, through the journaling process, because I think, as you mentioned, that self reflection, knowing who we are, it kind of, I think, also goes along with emotional intelligence, right? These are things that we can really only gain when we look at ourselves and do that reflective work. I do know because I recommend journaling all the time here on the podcast, and I will get listeners that will write in and, like, I just don't like journaling. And I tell them, you know what, take voice notes on your phone, just draw a picture, whatever it is that you just to
Yeah.
reflect. It's important to have that self-reflection. What do you say to the person who's like, oh, I'm too busy for that. I got so much going on. I don't have time to worry about myself. Because in a way, I feel like that gets kind of put as like, oh, that's for people who have time to think of themselves more. In my mind, it actually helps you think of yourself less eventually once you understand what's going on.
I totally agree with you, Melie, because here's the thing. It's a gift to yourself. I have, a lot of my men, I work a lot with men, and it is harder for them than the women, it seems, and they will do it on their phones or whatever. To me, it's not ideal because we know there is a kinesthetic component to journaling with just the physical motion, the brain connection and the hand movement. And you will have more significant aha moments, if you will, if you're actually writing. But I know in this day and age, that's a lot to ask. So, yeah, the voice is the second best thing. But to your point, it is so important. And I think of it as a gift really to the soul, because you're taking it's like you get up every morning, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you take your vitamins, you work out, whatever your routine is. If you could just commit to getting up 10 minutes earlier and sitting in a chair with your cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is and writing for 10 minutes, what I find when people do that, they get so hooked on it that they realize, wow, what a way to start my day. And I will tell you that my clients who do it consistently, I can tell because they will come, we meet every week. I can tell by the reporting that they give back to me and the dramatic shifts that have occurred from them because of their journaling, the awareness that comes up. is so much more significant than the ones that are not as consistent with it. They move through the process faster, they get more from it. And they always start out maybe the first few weeks trying to make me think they've journaled when they haven't. And I can always tell, but then they learn very quickly. Like they'll say, well, I only did it 3 times this week, or I only did it, 5 times. But once they get into it, and then they do it forever, because they realize that they get so much clarity and peace from just that one action. So I'm glad that we talked about it, because when you were asking me for a concrete action, I was, my mind was going through all the different scenarios that I see. But to me, journaling is the truest gift, and it's a spiritual practice, and if you're a person of faith, whatever faith you have, you sit down and you commune really literally with that divine part of you and the entity beyond, if you believe in such a thing. I have had the most tremendous healing experiences from my journaling, probably than even I'd say my prayer life, because my journaling is a part of my prayer life.
Love that, and I can definitely agree. I was like an on and off journaler for my whole life, but as I was going through a pretty traumatic divorce, I started doing gratitude journaling every day through that process. And now I can't imagine, it's evolved a bit more. I will sometimes write out a scripture and then, think through that or write through my day, but I can't imagine a day going by where I don't journal now. And it is such a time that I spend with God, with just understanding what's going on in my life. And I can truly say that it's helped me emotionally regulate. It has helped me understand things at a much higher level. So, yeah, I'm so glad we talked about this. It's something I am very passionate about.
And the other thing, when I talked about patterns, if I could just add this, what I love when you have a written journal, and I always have my clients do a weekly reflection where they go back and they highlight the patterns they've seen. I have gone back, Melie, into journals years and years ago and realized, oh my gosh, this was something that I wrote about 5 years ago. And it's still on my mind. Like one I can think of was when my son was much, like in high school. And I was so worried about him wanting to ever move out, as a young person with a disability. He was wheelchair bound. And then fast forward, 5 years later, and here it's still on my mind. Only the difference was he was asking to move out. And I thought, oh my gosh, this has been in our house, this energy around this concern. And now here it is, all these years later. But in my journals, there were many patterns of thought that were resolving the issue long before I even needed to, that I had forgotten about. And when I went back into the journals and saw them, I was like, wow, I actually have a plan formulated for how this could come to fruition, and didn't realize that I had been doing that all those years.
That's amazing. And I do feel like sometimes, as I will look back at my old journals as well, and my main time of journaling is somewhere between like 5:30 and 6 in the morning. So I have just gotten up. I've got my first cup of coffee. And it's sort of in those moments, I think, where you've just come out of sleep and you're in this like kind of, I almost get into like a flow state with it. And I write, I don't even necessarily know what I'm writing, but then I'll go back later and I'm like, "Oh, look at this. Wow, this is actually helpful." Sometimes it's not, but a lot of times it is.
Well, and for those listening who are faith-based, I mean, the Holy Spirit will show up very big in those early hours in your writings. And one of the other things that is really interesting to me when you think about, years ago, I have an MFA in creative nonfiction, and I've taught several seminars on how to write, memoir, because I'm very passionate about memoir. And I always tell my students, if you're writing every day, you're writing all day, because your mind is in that flow state. And then what happens, the same with journaling, is you wake up in the morning and you have a whole chapter in your head, or you have all these amazing, beautiful thoughts that just come up, because you're actually, I believe, and I've actually noticed it in myself, that some mornings I'm dreaming what I'm going to write about before I even waken.
Yeah.
And then you get up and it just comes out, and it's a beautiful, beautiful experience.
Yeah, I love that so much. Now, for the listener who's like, okay, this has been super helpful. I'm going to go and take that assessment. but they're also wondering what is sort of the next best step for someone who's realizing they may not know what stage they're in right now, but they realize they're starting to hit that peak of the emptiness of success. They have the car, the house, the job, the family, and it's like something is missing. What would be your number one piece of advice for that individual?
Well, yeah, it's so complicated. I think number one, first, as I mentioned earlier, is to know you're okay and you're going to be okay. You've just hit a place where your spirit, your soul, whatever we want to call it, is now wanting something different. And it doesn't mean you have to run off, in the old days, we used to call it burnout or middle age crisis, where, the old movies, the husband runs off with gold chains and a sports car and a 20-year-old or whatever. It doesn't mean you have to give up or run from the life of the past. It just means you can augment it with something deeper. So the first thing is noticing, okay, something's going on with me and I'm not crazy and I need to investigate it further. I want to pay attention to it. And then to recognize, because I just think even for myself, even being in this industry, you cannot necessarily do it alone because we can't see ourselves yet in the way that maybe a professional can see us and help us kind of maneuver this new landmine, if you will. And so that's where, I think it's important, depending on the level of what you're going through, you may need some therapy, you may need a coach, whatever it is seek out someone that can help you on that journey, because it is a journey and it never ends. We're constantly evolving and changing until the day we're in the ground. So there's no shame in that. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things. I certainly didn't get a PhD to be a coach, but it was coming to me all the time. So I realized, okay, I need to understand better ways to serve my clients. And I think the beauty of today is there's no shame in therapy or coaching. Coaching to me is, every athlete has a coach. I mean, it's just, we need someone to hold us accountable, to help us see our blind spots, to help us get through the shadows that may be covering up the divine part of who we are. And, seek that out, because you're not going to get it from your friends or your family. They're biased, and we are very good at creating confirmational bias with them and telling them what we want them to hear, so they'll affirm what we already want to know, not what we don't want to know. And so
Right.
it's very important to have a professional, objective. It doesn't mean you need to do it for years and years and years, but just to at least get you started and give you some clarity. And then if you can't do that, certainly there's so much information. We're almost overwhelmed with it now on the internet, classes, courses, books, YouTube. I mean, start to dive into whatever it is you need to know to reach that highest potential within yourself, because the world needs us to be at our highest potential. More than ever in the history of humanity, we are at a crucial point in time, and we need all of us together to be at the highest level of performance and consciousness, so that we can do what is right for the generations coming up.
Yes, absolutely. I love that so much. And we on this show talk a lot about coaching and getting help. So, yes, if you are somebody who is struggling with this, get somebody in your corner. Like Dr. Sharon said, sometimes friends and family, they mean well, but they don't always have the tools to help us. Or on the other side of that spectrum, you could have someone in your life like Job's wife, right? Who was not very helpful for him
Mhm.
in his time of need. So, absolutely, get that outside help. Dr. Sharon, thank you so much for being here today. I know that this episode is going to resonate with so many listeners and give them the tools that they need to start getting away from that emptiness of success and more into just a wholeness and living their true potential.
Thank you so much for having me on the show today. I really enjoyed it.
If today's episode resonated with you, could you share it with a friend who might be feeling that quiet ache behind achievement? And please be sure to check out Dr. Sharon's work. We will have links in the show notes below to her assessment, her book, her website, all of her insights, which will give you permission to breathe again. If you need a little help finding your own rhythm, please reach out to her. And until next time, remember, even when the hustle burns out and the trophies start to gather dust, there is still beauty waiting to be rebuilt. Thanks for listening to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. If today reminded you that resilience is a practice, not a personality trait, you're in the right place. Keep showing up, Keep rebuilding, and don't forget, even diamonds start as pressure and mess. For more faith-filled encouragement and real-life tools to help you heal and grow, check out the show notes for some free resources and ways to stay connected. See you next time.